Welcome to the Security Operative podcast. This is Tony O'Brien of Security Operative Consultancy Services, here to share with you my perspectives from the world of security and risk management. Enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to episode number 31 of the Security Operative podcast, the show where we talk all things security and security consultancy. Tony O'Brien here from Security Operative Consultancy Services again. And this week we are going to talk about writing security policies and procedures. So it's been almost 2 weeks now since we released an episode. This episode should have been released last week. It's based on a webinar that we ran at the end of February, our monthly webinar series on writing security policies and procedures. And as always, the following week, I do a general kind of synopsis on the subject, put the slides out for the general public. Very well attended workshop. We had people from five different countries. Yeah, we just under 30 people from 5 different countries listening in, which was great and good interaction on it. So I generally do a synopsis just to be fair to those people. They get the full access, and then we do a kind of summary afterwards, share the slides with people. But it's been incredibly busy 2 weeks with some stuff going on operationally, so we haven't got an episode out in. We skipped a week and now we're back into our cycle again of doing it one every week. So I'm going to try to keep this kind of maybe around the 45-minute mark, which is where the last one was. And we're going to just generally do an overrun of writing security policies and procedures. For those of you watching on YouTube, I'm going to have some slides there. For those of you listening on the podcast, I'm going to put a link to the PDF version of the slides in the podcast link in the show notes for the podcast. So anyone who wants to have a look at those can just click on them and go on to them. I'll also put in the clickable policy and procedure templates into it as well. So if anybody wants to get those, or you can get them on our websites if you prefer. So yeah, that's what we're going to talk about for the next while, writing security policies and procedures. So some of the content, I suppose, that we're going to cover when it comes to writing security policies and procedures. And anybody who's been in the industry for a while will tell you how wrong companies sometimes get this, Many companies, and the biggest mistake I see with security companies is that they start off writing a security policy and somewhere in the middle it turns into a security procedure, and it ends up being neither. So over the course of the next while, I suppose we're going to talk about, well, why we have policies and procedures, first of all, the different levels that they should be written at, who should be writing them, and why it's important that there's differentiation between the levels of policy writers and procedure writers, the differences between policy or procedure. My general template and framework for document control, keeping documents in order, in the right order, and having some kind of track, trace, and audit trail on your documents. Creating policy templates and procedure templates, and then we're going to talk a little bit, obviously, about writing policies, writing procedures, and then adding some visual aids. And I'm going to go through a system that I use for adding kind of visuals into it. It's a very good piece of software that I like to use. So I suppose if I start off, first of all, with the why have policies and procedures, or why is it important, I suppose one of the big things for me, and I advise clients, particularly at the start when they're starting off, security companies, security consultancies, whether that's private investigators, close protection industry, it doesn't matter, is having some structure on your business from the start. I made this mistake at the start. I started off a business that grew very organically. I wrote a lot of my policies and procedures. And then I underwent a very large piece of work in them bringing them back into a structure. And that often happens with small security companies. They start off writing their policies organically as and when they need them. And then they grow, but they don't grow in any kind of a structured way. They grow outwards. So I start off running my security company. I do most of the work. I don't need to document anything because I'm doing most of the work. Then I hire my first employees, and they tend to be friends and trusted advisors. So I hire those people. I bring them in and I spread my policy and procedure generally through word of mouth. And then by the third generation of hires, where I'm hiring people external to them, I need to have documented policies and procedures. But it becomes like a game of Chinese whispers now. I told John, John told Mary, and it keeps getting diluted. And the number of procedures have spread. And I perhaps have procedures and practices happening within my company that I don't even know about, because they've organically been created by subordinates and spread out in there, So it's important to have structure. It gives you some level of governance. So I always talk about hierarchy when it comes to policy and procedure writing. The person who is writing the policy should not be approving the policy. It should be approved either by somebody above them, or should at the very least be reviewed by somebody external. And similarly with procedures, that procedure writers should be having their procedures approved by people, hopefully the people who are writing the policies. So in general, unless you're a really small company, and even if you are, you should use some kind of externality to just double check your work and see that it makes sense, because it's very easy to say, yeah, I wrote the policy, I know what's right. without having it ever sense checked. And I suppose providing clarity for those on the ground of the structure, taking away that sure I didn't know excuse when something goes wrong. We provide structure, we provide clarity, and everybody's clear, everybody knows. So they're the kind of whys. Different levels then that I often talk about. I'm sure you're familiar with this from anyone who's been in the military. We often have the different levels of command, but it's the same in any company. You've got at the very top level, you've got strategic command and strategic overview. Then you've got your tactical command, and then you've got your operational on the ground stuff. So you've got your on the ground, you've got your mid-level, and then you've got your strategic leadership. And I often say that strategic leadership in a small to medium-sized company should be gone beyond policy and procedure right now. They should be really setting just the visions, values, and cultures of the company. And those at a mid-management level, the tactical level, the oversight level, they're the people who should be writing the policies. Now, the policies have to tie in with the vision and values of the company. And that's important. So they should come from that. And then below that, again, you have the operational level. And I always say the biggest input that we can put into our procedures is have the people who are applying those procedures give good input, potentially even writing them themselves and having them approved at the policy level. Because policy and procedures are linked. They're intrinsic to each other, intertwined with each other. The procedures should flow from the policy. So the procedures that the people on the ground are applying should flow from the policy, but they must be approved by the person who wrote that policy to make sure they meet the intent of the policy, and that's quite important. But it doesn't mean to say that the person who writes the policy has to write all of the procedures that are associated with that policy by any stretch of the imagination. I would say, like I said, the best input you can get for procedure writings is to get the people on the ground to document what it is that they're doing, and then you tweak that at a tactical level and approve it. And that's one of the things I share with people quite often. When you're starting off your security company as a security provider, even if you're on your own on the ground, document, document, document. What do I do when I arrive at a site? What do I do when I finish up on a site? How do I hand back to the client? What do I do during a meeting? What do I put into a contract? All those things. So when you expand, the structure exists, and it will probably still meet the vision and values that you set for your business as you grow. So the difference is then between policy and procedure. Very, very simple for me. Policy sets the why. Procedure details the who, what, when, where, and how. So policies for me are, I won't say aspirational, but they're aims and intents. A policy is how we aim to manage a particular subject or sector within our business. So we could have, like we said, a bully and harassment policy, how we aim to deal with bullying and harassment, our general intent around that. We could have an access control policy, how we intend to manage access control in our business. That policy then may have a range of procedures associated with it. And those procedures will go into specific situations where access control is required. And it will provide us with the who, what, when, where, and how of it. And that's the procedure. So we're going to take our general intent on a subject from the policy, and we're going to apply the flesh onto it. So the policy provides the bones, and then the procedures apply the flesh on top of it. So if you think about it in terms of, policy is intent, and then procedure is application, the application of that intent. So that's the general differences for me. And like I said, the biggest mistake that I see is people getting caught in the middle. They start off with a policy and they put a little bit of procedure in it, and then it becomes neither. It's not a policy or a procedure. It gets caught halfway in the middle. And the people who are applying it then, what starts to happen is the policy writer has written a bit of a procedure, and the people who are then being asked to apply it have had no input in it. So when they have no input, they're less likely to get some buy-in from it. And that's very, very important, I think. So when I'm doing policy and procedure designing, I generally start off, before we write any policies, before we start any procedures. In fact, the first thing I advise people to do when they start building their own company is to create a document control framework. Create a master sheet of all the documents you're going to have, some form of a framework at a variety of levels. And from then, when you're designing documents, you give each document an identifier. Now, I did on the webinar go into a little bit of detail on naming protocols and categories of policy and procedure. I'm not going to go into that on this. Suffice to say that you should have a structure to it. At the beginning, it might just be enough to go, a procedure 1, 2, 3, 4, 25, 26, 27, so on and so forth. As you expand, you might want to categorize your policies. So you might have corporate policies, operational policies, HR policies, legal policies. So you might want to categorize them as you go. And that's when I'm saying decide your structure at the very, very beginning. Another part, very important part of the document control is having version controls on your documents. As we update documents, that we're making sure that we have the latest version in circulation and we're taking out the other versions. That's very important. And you can't turn around and say, well, I'm just going to write it. It's always going to be the same policy procedure. That is not a policy or procedures. Policies and procedures are living documents. They change with context and they change as operationally required. That's very, very important. So we have to have some kind of a change management structure on that. We're updating the versions and we're keeping a log of, well, when are we updating those versions? Why did we update and what did we change and where did we put that change? The document control will also have in there the approval process. So like I said, anyone who's writing a procedure should be getting approved by somebody who wrote the policy. Anyone who wrote a policy should be getting approved by senior management. You will always have times where you're having senior management in a small organization also writing policy. But I think then, like I said, you use externality, use external consultants or advisors who are specialists in that area. The final bit then on document control I would always suggest is to have a distribution control. Knowing how many copies of this policy are in existence, particularly hard copies and soft copies though, and where are they stored? Where can I access them? Because when I update a version, I need to make sure that I get all of those distribution copies out of circulation and replace them with the new. Because what we can sometimes end up with is a situation where I have one copy of a procedure, the client has another, and the operational team on the ground has a third version because we've updated and only sent it to certain people and saved it. So how I get around that, design from the very start, a document control framework and a form master list. So a form master list can be something just as simple as you can go into auto updating macro enabled stuff if you want to when you get complicated. But for me, Excel document at the start, first column, big list of my form numbers, forms 1 to 50, whatever it might be. A description of each of those forms. So what is the name of those forms? The current version number, the last revised date, and then a link to where we can click that. So where if you're using some kind of a document storage, and everyone will have some kind of document storage, or should have at least, where it can be accessed externally. So, you might go, I tend to use a few. I have my general circulation documents, and then I have some that are secure and confidential for certain clients. So for general circulation, I use Microsoft products, SharePoint, OneDrive. Simply because most of my clients use Microsoft products. So I know that if I share a OneDrive link or a SharePoint link, the chances are that they will also have Microsoft and they can open it up or be able to access it. When you start using other stuff, like I said, you can get more secure ones. And two of the more secure ones that I use are pCloud, which is a Swiss secure file storage, which I think is very, very good. And Proton Drive, which is the file storage area, Proton Mail, which again is very, very secure, but less accessible. People who don't use those systems might not be able to access them. So it's always that conundrum between convenience of access and security, depending on what you're sharing and what you're keeping. But I would always have a dedicated link to the last version number. So when one of my clients or when my security person or whatever the case might be needs to access that, they just click that link and they know they're getting the very latest version as they access it. So we started off and we talk about, okay, let's talk about our templates, and whether it's a policy or procedure. At the very front of every policy or procedure, I have my document control table, and that comes back to my document framework. So my document control table, very short table, at the start of every policy or procedure, it tells me the policy reference number, what's the title, who developed it, and who approved it. And I'll also have a line in there for the version number and who reviewed it. So developed by and approved by will always be there from the very, very start. And then once I start going up in the versions, I say, well, who was the last person who then reviewed it and looked at it and made changes? And we'll have at the end of the document then a version control that says, well, what were those changes? And once I update it, what I do is I take out that old version and I store it in an archive. I will never ever get rid of it because, as somebody mentioned on the webinar, in the event of a court case, the judge or the solicitors, whatever, barristers, insurance companies, they're going to want to see the procedure that was in place at the time, not the procedure that you have in place now. So it's important to keep those archives as an audit trail of what went on and what happened as we went. So we'll have that document control table at the start. We'll also, at the end of each document, I put my distribution control and my version control table at the end of each policy and procedure. So distribution is just a very simple table. It has the number of copies, copy number 1, copy number 2, copy number 3, copy number 4, and where each of those copies are held. So copy number 1 is held by the client. Copy number 2 is held in my office. Copy number 3 is held on the site folder. And copy number 4 is with my insurance company. So I know when I update that procedure or manual or document that I have to go to those 4 places and make sure that they have been updated. And then, like I said, we'll have a version control, which will basically have my version number, all my version numbers, the dates that were changed, what changes I made, and why we made those changes. So was it as a result of an audit? Was it as a result of change of legislation? Feedback from employees, client requests. So why did we update it? And that gives us an audit log of the different changes that we have gone through with that policy or procedure. So when we get into then writing policies and procedures, first couple of things we need to have at the start of every policy or procedure. We need to have the scope of the policy or procedure, and we need to have the purpose for it. When I'm writing procedures, I'll also put in the context in which the procedure has been written. But scope and purpose you'll see across everything. The scope being what exactly does this policy cover, and also what is not covered. And the purpose being, well, why do we have this policy or procedure? So the scope, let me think of an example of scope. So if I have a violence at work policy, and I might choose to write the scope of my violence at work policy is, the scope of this policy is to cover all of our aims and intents around workplace violence, either between employees and contractors, or perpetrated by third parties on our employees. And then I'll have a line about what it does not cover. I'll say, this policy does not cover, or outside the scope of this policy, is third parties engaging in violence on each other. That's a different policy. Yeah. So the policy is designed to cover acts of violence by my employees against my employees, or by third parties against my employees. It's not designed to cover violence between third parties on one of my work sites. So that's telling me what's in and what's not. The purpose first to provide guidance on our expectations around workplace violence, and we'll give examples of that as we go through. I'll put in the show notes the link to the example. So when we're writing policies, then we have our policy, our document framework, we have our scope, we have our purpose. So then we get into actually writing our policy statement. And I would say security policy is a statement of your organization's position or intent on a particular subject. It can be generally short, and I would say the shorter the better. It can go to a few pages if it's a very intricate subject you're talking about. But I always say if you're going into multiple pages of a policy, you're probably moving into procedure, and you need to be separating the two. It can usually be a very short document and general in its content because you wanted to cover the overarching area. And it's designed to inform and aid with the design of procedures to be implemented. And then in countries where they have legal agency, it's usually signed by the head of function. So a security manager or director of the company who's going to be legally responsible for the implementation of this policy. So I would say a policy sets out the organization's aim and intent. It's brief and to the point around it, sets out a position, and then it will refer to procedures or risk assessments. So for example, I'll go back to that when we mentioned a minute ago, violence at work. We're going to protect staff from violence at work. We don't intend for staff to be exposed to violence at work. In order to support this, we have designed a range of procedures relating to violence at work. We have conducted a range of risk assessments. We'll provide adequate training, supervision, equipment, resources. So this is our aim and intent. We're not saying what that training will be or what the resources will be. We're saying we're going to provide what is adequate. The procedures will dictate what's needed for each of those then. And at the end of every policy, I would always include the consequence of not adhering to the policy. So for example, if it was a bullying policy, breaches of this policy or failure to adhere to this policy may result in disciplinary action up to and including dismissal. If it was a retail outlet and it was a staff discount policy, failure to adhere or breaches of this policy may result in withdrawal of staff discount privileges. So I have a line at the end that dictates it. So when we go into, if somebody does breach that policy or breaches procedures and we need to investigate, it was clear from the beginning what the consequence of that potentially was when they signed the document. So we talk about policy template. For those of you watching, I'm going to share a policy template on screen. For those of you listening, I'll put it in the slides for you guys. Let's make sure I have the right one here. Yeah. So this is my general policy template available on the website again for anyone that wants it. My policy title at the start of it, the policy table, like we said, our scope and purpose, and our policy statement. At the end of every policy then, I would have a little table for key responsibilities. Who has key and important responsibilities within this policy, and what are those policies? So for example, It might be that the managing director has responsibility for implementation of the policy, providing adequate resources, providing adequate equipment. The operations manager might have responsibility for ensuring that the staff receive training and assured they're supervised, and the site lead might have responsibility for ensuring it is implemented on their sites. And then after that, then I would have a list of associated procedures, because I might have a workplace violence policy or a access control policy that could have 10 to 15 procedures associated with it. So if I'm working in a hospitality venue, for example, a nightclub, and I have an access control policy, I might then have a policy on refusal of entry. I might have a policy on removal of patrons. I might have a policy on illegal entry through fire exit, or a procedure, sorry, on illegal entry, a procedure on removal of patrons, or procedure on refusal of entry, all associated with my access control policy. They're all taking their intent from my access control policy. And then finally, like we said, distribution channel and aversion control. So that's generally how I do policy writing. If we could move on then and talk a little about where we were at with procedure writing then. So procedures go into the who, where, how, what. Policy deals with the why, the intent and the aspiration. Now we're going into the meat and bones. So again, security procedures, I'll start off with my scope and my purpose. Then I will have, well, who exactly is affected by this procedure, internally and externally? Who has a part to play in it, internally and externally? I could have my security team, my site lead, the client's representatives, and externally I could have people like the police, fire service, depending on the type of policy. And they might have some mention of it, and that will become important later on why. I will have the equipment and resources that are required to implement this policy, where they'll be held, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail. The contents of the procedure, then the step-by-step guide that I want people to follow through when they're doing this particular task or job. What is the contingencies for if something goes wrong with this particular task? So the example I gave in the webinar was I might have a two-way radio procedure, and the contents of that procedure would be types of radio we use, the parts and functions of those radios, our call signs, our emergency codes, the pro words, radio etiquette. My contingencies might be, what happens if a radio is not working? What happens if the network fails? What happens if I lose a radio? They're my contingencies. What happens if this procedure is ineffective, it's not working? Escalation route, then we'll talk about in a few minutes. Who needs to know about what part of the procedure and why? And then finally, I'll always put record keeping and communication. So they're generally done, like I said, on a template as well. And like I said, if you're watching, I'll share it on the screen for you. If you're listening, I will make sure that it is shared on the notes for you. So my policy procedure, like I said, again, is available on the procedure template, sorry, is available on the website. Same table at the start, reference to the procedure, its title, who developed it, who approved it. The scope and context. Now, why I add context in procedures is that I might have an access control, a company-wide access control policy, but the procedures will be different from site to site. So my scope and context will be, for procedure, will be, this procedure is how we remove a patron from ABC site. We might have two-way radio procedures that are different on each site, but my communications policy will be the same across sites. So scope, purpose, any terms and definitions. We love an old term and definition in the security industry. We love our acronyms and models, ETAs and things like that, we love our 3 letters. So if there are in there and the layperson or the client is reading it, that we spell out exactly what they mean first time throughout. Any normative references. So does the procedure make reference to any external reference? And that could be things like specific pieces of legislation. So a link to that particular piece of legislation. It could include ISO standards that it's linking back to. It could include client-specific or industry-specific standards. It could include government guidelines, links to government guidelines. So any external stuff that we're going to be referencing through this policy. Who are the people involved, like we said, what internal employees are involved, and then what external people. What equipment and resources do I need for this procedure? So what equipment do I need to implement it? Where is that equipment located? And who is responsible for it? So for example, if it's, I need a first aid kit, it's an accident management procedure. The equipment is a first aid box. It's located at these places, and the person responsible for making sure it's there is the site lead or the site first aid or whatever it might be. Then we'll have my processes, the actual content of the procedure and the contingencies. And then I get down to my communication and escalation table. Now, what I do with communication and escalation, it's basically who needs to know about what part of the procedure, and that I know that they need to know and how. So what I will do is I will have at the start all of the people who were involved in this procedure, and I will list them across the top of a table, each column, give them each a column. And then I will list each part, each heading that I have in the procedure and the contingencies. So the example I have here is for two-way radio procedure, like I said. And the people involved were the security team, the security manager, the maintenance department, the operations manager, an external radio contractor, and the police, the Gardaí in Ireland. And then down the side, I have, well, what's in this procedure? I have the types of radio we use, the parts and functions, our call signs, our pro words, etiquette, emergency codes. And then for contingencies, I have radio fault, network failure, and lost and stolen. And I basically fill in the boxes where they intersect. Who needs to know about the radio type? Who needs to know about the call signs? Who needs to know about a lost or stolen radio? And I will fill that in the table. Next, then I'll have evidence generated. What evidence do we generate that we're actually implementing and applying this policy? So this one again is taken from a radio procedure, document number, whatever our framework document number is, a radio sign-out sheet that's located in the control room, and we retain it for 3 months. It also generates a maintenance report, and that's held in the maintenance room. And so all these things tell us that this procedure is working. A radio sign-out sheet tells us that we're signing in and out. It's evidence that this procedure, radios have been signing in and out. A maintenance report form tells us that the part of the procedure that talks about radio maintenance is being upheld. An incident report form tells us that the part of the radio where you have to fill in an incident report for losing a radio is being implemented. So it's generating evidence that these things are actually happening. And then finally, we'll have our monitoring, our distribution, and our version control, like we said. So that's my general one with procedure writing. So generally, like I said, procedures can be an awful lot longer, as I would have mentioned. As I also mentioned, I'm going to put the examples in there for anyone who wants to download them. But I want to finish up by talking about visual aids and a particular piece of software that I use. Now, I wouldn't be a massive fan of Microsoft, but I use them, obviously Microsoft Office, etc., etc. But one of the ones that I do really like is Microsoft Visio. It's one of the ones that I'm willing to pay a fair bit of extra money for. Microsoft Visio is basically allows you to draw diagrams, things like process flow charts, building plans, things like that. It's a fantastic piece. I think in the Microsoft Business package, it costs about $12 a month, which is equivalent about €10 a month, I think, in or around. Or you can buy it outright in a yearly license for about 150 quid. But basically what it allows me to do, it has all the process flowchart signs from things like the ISO standards or anything like that, and it allows you to build really professional looking process flowcharts for procedures. So not only can I have a written procedure, I can also have a process flowchart next to it, because like we said, people learn differently. And one of the questions that was asked on the webinar was about how do we make sure staff read them? And so you put it in as many formats as possible. So when I develop a policy or procedure for a client, I'll have the written policy or procedure. I'll then, with procedures, I'll put them into a flowchart. And then with both policy and procedure, what I generally do is I embed a QR code on the bottom corner of the back page of each procedure. And underneath it, I have written, if you would prefer to have this procedure in video format, click here or scan here. So they scan the QR code and it takes them directly to a private Vimeo or YouTube of me talking through the policy. So the more ways we have of staff, for staff to learn and for staff to educate, the more chances of this, So accident management, they might not be able to, in the event of an accident, read through it or remember everything, but they can scan the QR code and there's a video of somebody talking them through what exactly they should do in the aftermath of an accident. So the more formats, or they might have a process flowchart there that takes them right through the steps that they go through. The other thing it's very, very good for is designing maps and floor plans. It gives you all sorts of things for designing rooms, kitchens, boardroom setups, control room setups, mock-ups. I've drawn entire hotels using Visio. I think it's fantastic. It even has all the fire signage and things like that on it. So you can do complete fire plans of buildings, has all the proper signage, extinguishers, fire exits, all that kind of stuff. So it's one that I'm a big, big fan of. It's Microsoft Visio, V-I-S-I-O. I really recommend, if you're in consultancy or security management, you check it out. It's a very, very good system. So that's really a very, very quick synopsis of what we would have covered on the webinar. Next month's webinar, we have a poll out at the moment on what people want to cover. It's either going to be on starting a small security company in Ireland, which obviously loses a little bit of international appeal, but will have some appeal, have some interest with people, or how to write an assignment instruction. I put a poll out on Facebook the other day. At the moment, it's dead tight. So I'm not sure which people would prefer. I'm going to do both. It's just a matter of which one comes first, I suppose. We have another couple of guests coming up then after that. We've got an article coming out later this week. So this video will be out probably Wednesday of this week, and the article will probably be out on Friday. And then next week we have another solo video, non-webinar related, about a different topic. So until then, thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me about writing security policies and procedures. This has been Tony O'Brien from Security Operative Consultancy Services saying thank you for listening to episode 31, and see you guys all next week. Thank you for listening to the Security Operative podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show and got some value. If you'd like to follow more of our activity, you can find us on any of our social channels at Security Operative Consultancy Services. See you next time.